In 1989, a convoy of vehicles drove straight into the restricted zone. Inside were wildlife specialists dressed in full protective gear, carrying sealed cages containing 714 prairie dogs. When the vehicles stopped, the devastated landscape in front of them clearly looked like a place where nothing should have been able to survive. Most of the vegetation was nearly dead, and they could not see a single living creature. More than 600 highly toxic chemical compounds had been detected in the soil and groundwater, ranging from mustard gas and nerve agents to massive amounts of pesticides, enough to kill almost anything that came into contact with them. The cage doors swung open, and the prairie dogs burst out like daredevils. Some rushed straight into old burrows, while others stood upright among the short grass, their sharp calls echoing across the area. At first, people only hoped they could survive, dig a few burrows, and help keep the dust down. But what happened next went far beyond anyone's expectations. The truly strange, almost unbelievable events only began when scientists reviewed footage from the camera traps. Even they could not explain what they were seeing. No one expected them to appear here. How could one of the most hated animals on the prairie end up performing so many ecological miracles on land that had essentially been declared dead? But to understand why these small animals mattered so much, we have to look back at the North American prairie, a landscape once as large as the European Union, home to bison, wolves, eagles, and 5 billion prairie dogs. Over time, however, hunting, land development, and disease caused black-tailed prairie dogs to lose more than 95% of their historic range. In just a few decades, one of the greatest ecosystems on the planet had been transformed into semi-desert. Fortunately, some surviving populations had gathered at Rocky Mountain Arsenal, but this place would not remain safe forever. Beginning in World War II, more than 17,000 acres of prairie were turned into a site for producing chemical weapons and pesticides. Toxic substances gradually seeped into the soil and groundwater. People eventually abandoned the area completely, leaving behind factories, storage tanks, and pipelines across a severely damaged landscape. By 1987, the contamination had become so serious that the site was added to the U.S. Superfund list. Some reports even describe the land as ecologically dead. So how did prairie dogs help save a landscape that had taken more than a century to decline? But before animals could be brought back, people first had to make the area safe enough, and the way they did it was unusual. Over the next 15 years, the U.S. Army and Shell Oil spent $2.1 billion on one of the most expensive soil removal cleanup operations in U.S. environmental history. In the most heavily contaminated areas, soil was excavated to depths of up to 10 feet, then buried in sealed containment areas or capped in place. Beneath the surface, 5 groundwater treatment systems continuously pumped and cleaned contaminated water. Instead of completely eliminating the toxins, they chose temporary containment solutions, and for the next 40 years, the area remained sealed off, with keep out signs posted everywhere. As the land around Denver was gradually plowed up and urbanized, there were almost no homes, farms, or residential developments inside the restricted area. With little human disturbance, patches of short grass prairie began to recover. Then deer, coyotes, burrowing owls, and even bald eagles from around Denver gradually began moving in and taking refuge there. Even after seeing so many animals return, they still were not sure the area had become any safer. It was only after an event that shocked the country that the reintroduction plan officially began. In 1986, biologists discovered bald eagles, an extremely rare species at the time, wintering right in the middle of this contaminated landscape. That surprising discovery proved that the arsenal still had significant ecological value. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service immediately became more deeply involved, and after years of debate, Congress finally designated the area as a national wildlife refuge. So what did the monitoring footage reveal after the prairie dogs were released? We'll return to those unexpected changes later. Because before they could create any ecological miracles, the prairie dogs first had to survive a disaster that nearly wiped them out. During the summer of 1988-1989 sylvatic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread by fleas, swept through Rocky Mountain Arsenal and destroyed about 95% of the prairie dog population. The burrow entrances were still there, but the once noisy colonies had fallen almost completely silent. In August 1989, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began a campaign to bring them back. A total of 714 prairie dogs were relocated, 134 from other areas within the arsenal, 534 rescued by Prairie Dog Rescue from sites around Denver, and 46 used for telemetry research. Before release, the grass was cut and the burrows were treated for fleas. The prairie dogs were sprayed with flea control treatment, their age and sex were recorded, they were fitted with ear tags, and then 4 or 5 animals were released into each empty burrow. Now let's answer the most important question in this story. What exactly did the prairie dogs do here? Do not let their bodies, each weighing just over 2 pounds, fool you. Since 1994, ecologists have recognized prairie dogs as a keystone species, small animals with an outsized impact on the entire ecosystem. The USGS later also classified them as ecosystem engineers because they alter the soil, vegetation, prey availability, and multiple levels of the food web. The first effect began right beneath their feet. Every day, their small claws scratched at the ground, expanding a burrow network with multiple entrances and chambers deep below the surface. Soil that had once been compacted was loosened and mixed. Deeper soil layers were brought up to the surface, while waste and plant material were worked back into the ground. Studies have shown that prairie dog activity increases soil mixing and can alter nitrogen levels in the soil processes that are important to nutrient cycling. Put simply, imagine thousands of animals constantly digging, turning, and rearranging every yard of earth. What was once a relatively uniform surface gradually became thousands of mounds, burrow openings, and patches with completely different structure. The soil began cycling nutrients again. Prairie dogs did not just dig burrows. They were rebuilding the soil from the inside out. They also constantly clipped the grass short around their colonies, partly so they could keep a clear view and spot coyotes, hawks, or badgers from a distance. As a result, islands of short grass and bare ground began appearing within the taller vegetation. To us, that might look like damaged grassland, but for many other species, it was exactly the kind of habitat that had been missing. Mountain plovers need flat ground, very low vegetation, and lots of open space for nesting. USDA research has shown that prairie dog grazing creates precisely that kind of environment. Burrowing owls, meanwhile, hardly need to dig homes of their own. They often take over abandoned prairie dog burrows, turning those tunnels into shelter and nesting sites. From here, the effects began spreading up through the food web. AUS Forest Service review, drawing on multiple studies, estimated that more than 150 animal species and other organisms are associated in varying degrees with prairie dogs or their colonies. And the species that most clearly shows just how important prairie dogs are is the black-footed ferret. About 90% of its diet consists of prairie dogs, and it also uses these same tunnel systems for shelter. When prairie dog towns were poisoned, fragmented, and devastated by plague, ferrets nearly disappeared with them. Once believed extinct in 1979, they were rediscovered in Wyoming in 1981, launching a recovery program. By October 2015, reintroducing ferrets at Rocky Mountain Arsenal was only possible because the refuge had already developed prairie dog colonies large enough to support them. Studies at the arsenal found that birds nesting in areas with active prairie dog colonies often produce larger young with better chances of survival, thanks to improved food availability and more favorable habitat. As prairie dog colonies continued to expand, these concentrated prey populations also drew predators back. Ferruginous hawks and red-tailed hawks began establishing territories above the prairie dog towns, while bald eagles, the same species that had helped push the decision to protect the arsenal in the 1980s, also began appearing in greater numbers, roosting in cottonwood trees and hunting prairie dogs during winter. But the chain of recovery did not stop there. In 2007, managers brought bison back to the refuge because of their long ecological relationship with prairie dogs across the Great Plains. Prairie dogs clip vegetation low and encourage the growth of young, nutrient-rich plants, while bison graze the taller grasses around the edges of the colonies, helping maintain the open spaces prairie dogs need to watch for predators. In this way, the two species create a mutually supportive cycle, gradually rebuilding the structure of the ancient prairie. That is the real power of a keystone species. Prairie dogs did not save the prairie through a single miracle. They created the conditions that allowed a whole network of ecological relationships to function again. And when we lose them, we do not just lose a rodent, we may lose part of the very structure that makes a prairie a prairie. On the 9th of October, 1992, Rocky Mountain Arsenal officially entered a new chapter when President George H.W. Bush signed legislation establishing the National Wildlife Refuge, paving the way to transform land once used to produce chemical weapons into a wildlife sanctuary. By then, prairie dog towns had spread across more than 5,000 acres. Nearly 100 bald eagles came to winter there on average each year, along with hawks, deer, coyotes, burrowing owls, and many species of waterfowl. But this was still far from a paradise. In that same statement, Bush emphasized that the Superfund cleanup still had to continue. Nature had begun to return, but beneath the green grass, the arsenal's toxic past had not completely disappeared. The total cleanup cost eventually reached about $2.1 billion, and at one point accounted for as much as 80% of the U.S. Department of Defense's environmental cleanup budget. Humans had to spend billions of dollars dealing with the contamination. But the creature helping rebuild the ecosystem above ground was a rodent weighing only about 2 pounds, the prairie dog. But when the project became too successful, another problem emerged. Prairie dogs recovered so strongly that people once again had to find ways to stop them from spreading further. You heard that right. By around 2010, prairie dog towns at Rocky Mountain Arsenal covered about 3,863 acres. A later conservative estimate, using a density of roughly 30 prairie dogs per acre across nearly 3,000 acres, suggested that the population may have reached around 90,000 animals at one point. From the small colonies that once needed to be rescued, they were now digging burrows across vast areas. But prairie dogs do not understand which areas are habitat meant for restoration and which structures people need to protect. They began expanding into revegetation sites, landfill covers, areas around buildings, sewage lagoons, and other sensitive infrastructure. New dirt mounds kept appearing, and burrow entrances opened in places where people had spent millions of dollars just a few years earlier trying to stabilize the ground. By 2012, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was forced to take action. In just 1 year, 1,766 prairie dogs were captured and removed from areas where their numbers needed to be controlled. Of those, 1,456 were sent to the Black-footed Ferret Conservation Center, while 310 went to the Birds of Prey Foundation. Another 941 animals were removed from designated management zones. In total, more than 2,700 prairie dogs were captured, relocated, or controlled in a single year. It was an image almost completely opposite to what had happened in 1989. Back then, people were trying to save every prairie dog they could. 2 decades later, they were having to limit the very population they had once worked so hard to restore. But Rocky Mountain Arsenal is not the only place showing how a prairie dog colony can reshape an entire landscape. As ecologists looked farther across the American Southwest and northern Mexico, they began seeing the same pattern again and again. Where prairie dogs disappeared, grasslands changed. Where they returned, many ecological processes began to recover. One of the clearest examples is in Arizona. Black-tailed prairie dogs once lived there, but after decades of poisoning and control efforts, they disappeared completely from the state by around 1960. In 1972, Arizona tried to bring them back near Elgin, but the attempt failed. Nearly half a century later, managers tried again at Las Ciénegas National Conservation Area, this time with a much more careful approach. They dug artificial burrows, installed underground shelter chambers connected by pipes, and placed acclimation cages above them to keep the prairie dogs at the site long enough before fully releasing them. In 2008, 74 prairie dogs were brought to Road Canyon. In 2009, 68 were released at Mud Springs, and in 2010, another 64 established the Cieneguita colony. But nature immediately showed them that restoration is never a straight line. In 2011, one colony declined by about 54% in just a few weeks. Drought reduced food availability, forcing prairie dogs to travel farther from their burrows and making them easier targets for coyotes and birds of prey. Managers even had to provide supplemental food. By 2012, the situation had begun to reverse. At the site that had faced the crisis, they recorded at least 70 pups, while Cieneguita had about 99 individuals. A species that had been gone from Arizona for decades was finally beginning to rebuild its first towns. But the strongest evidence appeared in Chihuahua, Mexico. In the Llanos Casas Grandes region, prairie dogs were not reintroduced. They had naturally occupied a system covering roughly 55,000 hectares. As their populations declined, researchers had a rare opportunity to observe what happens when an ecosystem engineer disappears. From 1988 to 2004, the total area covered by prairie dog colonies there declined by about 73%, while average density fell from roughly 25 animals per hectare to just 2 per hectare. At Los Ratones, prairie dogs were poisoned in the late 1980s. After they disappeared, shrubs began invading the grassland. In only about 8 years, areas that had once been open grassland shifted dramatically towards shrubland, especially mesquite and ephedra. The real concern was not any single shrub, but the fact that the structure of the entire landscape was beginning to change. Short grasses disappeared, open visibility declined, and habitat that had once supported many grassland species increasingly resembled dense shrubland. Then at La Boscola, scientists were able to witness the opposite process. From 2000 to 2005, a prairie dog colony expanded by about 208 hectares, pushing directly into an area dominated by ephedra. No herbicides, no bulldozers. Prairie dogs simply did what they had done for thousands of years, biting shoots, clipping stems, digging around roots, and damaging shrubs that blocked their view. As a result, ephedra plants inside the colony averaged only about 34.1 centimeters tall, compared with 75.5 centimeters just outside the colony. About 81% of ephedra plants inside the colony showed signs of prairie dog feeding, but just 50 meters beyond the colony boundary, that figure dropped to around 3%. In some places, the colony boundary advanced as far as 546 meters into the shrubland, and the effects were not limited to what could be seen above ground. When researchers measured water infiltration at Janos, the results were clear. Prairie dog grassland reached about 357 millimeters per hour, grassland without prairie dogs about 283 millimeters per hour, while mesquite shrubland reached only about 97 millimeters per hour. In other words, water infiltrated the soil in prairie dog grassland nearly 3.7 times faster than in mesquite shrubland. Even the common belief that prairie dogs eat all the grass meant for livestock became more complicated. Usable forage biomass for livestock was measured at about 916 kilograms per hectare in prairie dog grassland, compared with 794 kilograms per hectare in grassland without prairie dogs, and only 489 kilograms per hectare in mesquite shrubland. But the science also revealed another important lesson. Prairie dogs do not create miracles in just a few weeks. At Civilta National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico, researchers reintroduced 60 Gunnison's prairie dogs in 1997 to an area where they had once lived, then compared it with a control site. After the first year, they found almost no significant changes in the total number of small mammals or overall vegetation cover. No dead landscape turned green overnight. No entire ecosystem suddenly exploded back to life. That forced scientists to take a longer-term view. Civilta later became a much larger program, with the goal of relocating around 3,000 prairie dogs, establishing 5-6 colonies across roughly 500 hectares, and monitoring soil, vegetation, insects, and population dynamics over many years. And only when all of these places are viewed together, Rocky Mountain, Arsenal, Arizona, Chihuahua, and New Mexico, does the larger picture become clear. Prairie dogs are not animals that simply replant the prairie. They are engineers that create the conditions that allow prairie ecosystems to keep functioning. They help keep shrubs under control, maintain open grasslands, alter soil structure, influence water movement, create thousands of underground shelters, and provide prey for an entire chain of predators. In the end, the story of prairie dogs is not just the story of an animal that was once hunted and later brought back. It reveals a much larger truth. An ecosystem is not built by plants alone, but by thousands of relationships between soil, water, prey, predators, and even the smallest species that seem easy to overlook. At Rocky Mountain Arsenal, prairie dogs did not remove the toxins themselves or turn a dead landscape into a paradise. But when they returned, the tunnels they dug, the short grasslands they created, and the food source they provided helped many parts of the ecological system begin functioning again. In Arizona, New Mexico, and Chihuahua, science continues to show the same lesson. When prairie dogs disappear, the prairie begins to change. When they return, the possibility of recovery returns with them. But success also brings a paradox. Sometimes, people end up having to control the very species they once worked so hard to save. Because restoring nature is not about making one species as abundant as possible, it is about restoring balance. What do you think? Are prairie dogs pests, or are they some of the most important engineers of the prairie? Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and don't miss the next video where we'll explore an even more surprising wildlife restoration project.